Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about a neighbor who threw my things into the pool. I remember the exact day when I realized I couldn't ignore my neighbor's behavior any longer. It was a quiet morning in late spring, just after sunrise, and I was standing at the edge of my newly installed fence line, sipping coffee and listening to the distant hum of traffic on the state road that wound beyond the far fields. The air was crisp enough to carry even the smallest sounds. The birds were chirping. The dew was clinging to the grass, and as I pressed my boot heel into the moist soil, I caught sight of my neighbor Gentry, standing on the far side of my property with his arms folded tight against his chest. I felt a spark of frustration in my gut even before he spoke. Gentry had been a thorn in my side for the better part of a year, ever since I finalized the purchase of my home and the surrounding land. The property included a nice house, a workshop, a large wooden barn that was more decorative than functional, and a sprawling piece of acreage out back. Roughly 10 acres, according to the county records and the survey I paid good money for. But Gentry insisted that a small 1.5-acre strip that ran along the east side of my property, right near the shared boundary, had long belonged to his family. He made all kinds of claims, that his late father had maintained that piece for decades, that he had moved a fence post years ago to mark it, that the little path running through that area was once part of his own driveway. None of that stood up against the legal paperwork, which firmly established my ownership. Yet, despite multiple polite conversations, multiple reminders of the official survey, and even an offer of mediation, Gentry refused to back down. In fact, as the weeks passed, he escalated. He started small, letting his dogs run onto my land so I had to pick up after them. Then he'd leave strange notes taped to my mailbox claiming I was stealing his birthright. I tried ignoring him, hoping he'd calm down with time or that some third party, like a friend of his, would talk sense into him, but it only got worse. That morning, I saw him glaring at the newly installed boundary markers. I had hired a professional surveyor just 2 months prior to confirm the property lines after Gentry's first round of allegations. The surveyor placed bright plastic flags along the boundary and even installed a few permanent markers in the ground to ensure there could be no confusion. Standing there, Gentry's face was twisted up, full of anger and, I suppose, pride. He caught my eye and shouted across the short distance, "You know this isn't over," before stomping off. I took a slow sip of my coffee and decided I wouldn't be intimidated. I had plans for that disputed 1.5-acre strip. A landscape architect friend of mine, Marlene, was advising me on how to turn it into a small orchard with a handful of apple trees and a couple of pear trees. The soil was good there. My plan was to grow a small seasonal business selling fresh apples and pears at a local farmer's market. It was a simple dream, one that reminded me of summers spent on my grandfather's farm when I was a kid. I had visions of well-tended rows of trees, a little wooden sign at the entrance, maybe even a U-pick day in the fall to invite neighbors and local families. But Gentry's anger loomed over that project like a storm cloud. Just a week after that tense morning, I was out of town for a weekend visiting family. When I returned, I found something that made my heart sink. My front porch chairs, handmade Adirondack chairs that I'd spent hours sanding and staining, were gone. My potted plants, which lined the walkway, were scattered. I walked around to my backyard and discovered an absolute mess. My belongings that had been on the porch, including some old tools, a decorative wooden crate I'd picked up at a craft fair, and even a small statue that once belonged to my grandmother, were all floating in my swimming pool. More than that, I found muddy footprints leading from my side gate straight across my patio. At first, I just stood there, mouth open, trying to process what I was seeing. Who would do something so strange and senseless? The muddy footprints were a clue, and there was a broken piece of the fence near the side yard that I hadn't noticed before. Then it hit me like a punch in the stomach. Gentry. He must have hopped the fence and done this while I was gone, either as some form of revenge or maybe as a twisted attempt to push me off the land. Maybe he thought if he intimidated me enough, I'd just pack up and sell him the disputed acreage. Well, he picked the wrong target. The good news, if there could be any silver lining, was that I had installed security cameras a few months back. After Gentry started making accusations and wandering a little too close for comfort on a few occasions, I invested in a set of reliable outdoor cameras with night vision and motion detection. It wasn't just for him. I lived a bit off the beaten path and it gave me peace of mind. But now I had a feeling those cameras would show me something very important. I rushed inside, leaving my soggy belongings behind for the moment. My heart was racing as I booted up my computer and navigated to the camera footage. Sure enough, late on the previous night, somewhere around midnight, there was Gentry, his face partially visible in the camera by the patio light. He climbed over the fence wearing gloves and a hooded jacket. He clearly had no idea I had cameras set so strategically. The footage showed him grabbing items from my porch and tossing them right into the pool. He even paused a couple of times, maybe listening for noise or cars, then went back for more. He took a bizarre amount of care to lift a large ceramic planter and lob it in. I watched, furious and saddened. This wasn't just someone being petty. This was a crime. Trespassing, vandalism, destruction of property. Call it what you will. And I had it all on tape. I didn't hesitate. I called the authorities and they took my statement. An officer came by to see the damage in the video. He whistled softly under his breath when he realized how thorough the recordings were. "This is going to be pretty open and shut," he told me. "You've got him on your property at night, clearly causing damage. I don't see how he's going to spin this." And I didn't want to jump straight into pressing charges, but at that point, I felt I had no choice. I'd tried reasoning with Gentry. I'd tried standing my ground politely. He responded by ramping up the aggression. Another neighbor down the road, Jana, had told me a month prior that Gentry bragged about getting even with me. Jana had warned me, "Be careful with him. He's prideful and doesn't like losing." I guess he saw the boundary dispute as losing face. Well, now he'd gone too far and I had the evidence to prove it. Over the next few days, I started cleaning up the mess. My beautiful Adirondack chairs were waterlogged and warped. The seat cushions were ruined. Some of my tools were salvageable after a good drying and oiling, but the old wooden crate was a goner. My grandmother's statue, an old ceramic angel, had chipped after hitting the side of the pool. I felt a sharp pain in my chest when I saw that damage. That angel meant more to me than the rest of the items combined. It had stood on her porch for as long as I could remember, and when she passed, it was passed down to me as a keepsake. Now there was a chunk missing from one of the wings, and a long crack ran across the base. I documented everything with photos, receipts for the chairs and cushions, and an estimate for repairs to my property fence. There was a scratch mark on the wooden frame of the patio door where Gentry might have tried to open it. Fortunately, he didn't get inside. A day later, an officer informed me that Gentry had been picked up and questioned. Gentry denied everything at first, until he was shown the footage. Then he claimed I had somehow set him up, which made no sense. The camera timestamps, the date, the location, they were undeniable. He was arrested on charges that included trespassing and vandalism. Given that I had clear evidence and the damages were not insignificant, the prosecutor took a keen interest. This wasn't just a neighborly spat, it was a criminal act. What I found almost more unsettling was that Gentry had been preparing other forms of harassment. After the arrest, an acquaintance who knew him socially mentioned to me that Gentry had been planning to scatter trash on my land near the disputed boundary, hoping to create an eyesore that would lower my property's appeal. He also apparently talked about planting some stolen lawn equipment on my property to cause me trouble. Hearing that made me shudder. I had no idea he was willing to go to such lengths. That same acquaintance, a man named Rico who lived further down the road, also told me something else. Gentry had tried to rally a few neighbors into believing I had somehow swindled him out of his family's land. He tried to spin a story that my surveyor was crooked, that I tampered with boundary markers, and that I was bullying him. Fortunately, no one believed him. Rico said most folks around here knew Gentry was prone to tall tales and outbursts. Still, it bothered me that he tried to ruin my reputation among people I barely knew. I decided to be proactive. I met with a few neighbors in a friendly setting, the local feed store's small cafe area, just to say hello and talk about recent events. I wanted them to hear from me directly what had happened, and I kept it brief and factual. I explained that I'd settled the property line issue legally. I showed them a copy of the survey when they asked. It was a public record anyway. And I let them know I had no intention of being a bad neighbor. In fact, I talked about my plans for the orchard and how I hoped to share some of the fruit with everyone around. Most of them sympathized, and a few even offered to help me get started by giving me cuttings from their own fruit trees. It was a heartening moment in the midst of so much negativity. Meanwhile, I had to handle the legal side. I pressed charges and the case went to court. My attorney, a resourceful person named Hillary, took the straightforward approach. Present the footage, present the damage estimates, present the previous complaints I had made about Gentry's trespassing. Hillary also reminded me that sometimes these cases drag on, but it turned out Gentry's lawyer didn't have much to work with. The judge gave Gentry a jail sentence. It wasn't incredibly long, just a few months, but it was more than I expected for what might be seen as a petty vandalism case. The judge's reasoning was that Gentry had clearly planned this, showed no remorse, and had a history of minor run-ins with the law over property disputes elsewhere. Evidently, he had not learned his lesson from past warnings. This time, the judge wanted to make it clear that such harassment wouldn't be tolerated. The sentencing eased some of my tension. But I didn't just want him in jail. I wanted peace of mind. Knowing he couldn't waltz into my yard in the dead of night was a relief. I also filed for a restraining order to ensure that when he got out, he would have to stay away from me and my property. The order was granted without hassle. In the meantime, with Gentry out of the picture, I turned back to my orchard plans. I worked closely with Marlene, who helped me map out where to plant the apple and pear trees. We tested the soil, dug holes, set up irrigation lines, and got everything in order. I spent afternoons planting saplings, visualizing how in a few years I'd see blossoms and then fruit. The process brought me a kind of healing. Every time I pressed a shovel into the earth, I let go of a bit of the anger I'd felt when I found my grandmother's statue chipped. Every time I ran the hose over the fresh soil, I washed away the bitterness that Gentry's actions had caused. My life began to normalize again. Without Gentry's looming presence, I found myself becoming more involved in the small community around me. I joined a local gardening club, met a few more neighbors, and even attended a farmer's market workshop to learn the ins and outs of selling produce. I made friends with a couple who lived just down the road, Victor and Lainey, who were enthusiastic gardeners themselves. They told me how excited they were to see the orchard come to life, and they offered help if I ever needed it. The warmth of the community made me realize that Gentry was an outlier, not the norm. Over the summer, as Gentry served his sentence, I put up a new fence, a sturdier, taller one, and posted clear no trespassing signs along the perimeter. I even installed additional cameras to cover blind spots. I wasn't going to be paranoid, but I also knew better than to leave myself vulnerable. With the evidence I had and the legal backing I'd received, I felt much safer. I also made sure that my insurance covered vandalism, just in case something like this ever happened again. My grandmother's statue needed special care. I found a local artisan who specialized in repairing vintage ceramics. He couldn't restore the angel to perfect condition. There'd always be a subtle line where the repair was done. But he managed to smooth the edges, fill the crack, and repaint it so that it looked nearly whole. He was gentle in handling it, and when he handed it back, he said, "This statue has a story now, one that shows it survived something tough." I placed it back in its spot near the porch, determined to let it remind me of resilience rather than loss. While dealing with the orchard and the aftermath of the vandalism, I learned more about Gentry's past. Neighbors told me that years before I arrived, he had a dispute with someone else down the road about a right-of-way for access to a fishing pond. Apparently, he tried to claim the pond was on his land and blocked people from using it. That ended in a tense situation with the county sheriff stepping in. Another time, he argued with a different neighbor over a line of cherry trees that he said belonged to him. It seemed he had a pattern of behaving like this, always convinced the world was cheating him. I guess I ended up being the first person who stood his ground with legal recourse and rock-solid evidence. In some odd way, I think the community was relieved. A few people confided in me that Gentry had always made them uneasy, but they never had enough reason to confront him. My case changed that perspective. People saw that if you stand up for yourself and follow the legal steps, justice can prevail. By early fall, the orchard was looking promising. The young trees wouldn't bear fruit for another year or two, but they seemed healthy and well-tended. I placed a few benches at strategic spots, imagining a future where neighbors might come by on a sunny afternoon to chat, sample a fresh apple, and enjoy the scenery. On weekends, I worked on fixing up the barn a bit more. I reinforced some of the beams and gave the door a fresh coat of paint. My property was becoming what I had envisioned when I first bought it: a peaceful, welcoming homestead. Gentry's sentencing was a hot topic for a while. People would ask me if I felt safer now, and I'd say yes, I did. But I also felt something else, a sense of responsibility. I wanted to ensure that no other neighbor had to endure what I went through. I began attending a few town meetings, learning how boundary disputes were handled, and even suggesting that the local township provide clearer guidelines and resources for resolving landline issues amicably. While no sweeping policy changes happened overnight, A few local officials took note of my suggestions. They said they might produce a simple pamphlet for residents explaining how to get an official survey, how to check property records at the county office, and how to mediate before conflicts escalate. In the back of my mind, I knew Gentry would eventually get out of jail. And sure enough, the day came. I was nervous, of course. Would he come back with more anger, more schemes? But he had a restraining order against him now. He couldn't come near my property without risking immediate arrest. And if he tried again, my cameras and security would be waiting. I also felt more connected to my community, which made me feel less alone and vulnerable. The first time I spotted Gentry after his release was a few months later, just before winter set in. I was driving into town for supplies, and I saw him walking down the shoulder of the road. He looked thinner and older, and he turned his head away when he noticed my truck. That suited me fine. I had no desire to speak to him. I just wanted to live my life in peace. A week after that sighting, I ran into Rico at the feed store again. He told me Gentry tried to sell his property, but buyers were skeptical due to rumors of his behavior. Eventually, a distant relative of his ended up buying it at a reduced price. I heard that Gentry left town not long after. The new owner, a middle-aged woman named Corinne, introduced herself to me when I was out by the fence line one afternoon. She said she'd heard about the unpleasantness and wanted to assure me that she had zero interest in fighting over the land. In fact, she asked if I had any advice on setting up a small flower bed on her side of the property line. We spoke for a good hour about soil types, irrigation, and what grows best in the local climate. It was a pleasant, healing conversation. Over that next year, I poured myself into my orchard, my home improvements, and my new friendships. Victor and Lainey came by to help me plant some shrubs around the patio. Marlene visited and gave me tips on pruning the young trees. Jana shared some old gardening magazines that had apple pie recipes I might offer to customers once I had my first harvest. My once solitary homestead now felt like it was part of a supportive network of good people who appreciated my willingness to become part of the community. I also took the step of upgrading my home security system further, not out of paranoia, but out of a newfound dedication to protecting what I worked so hard to build. I installed motion sensor lights around the barn, replaced the gate locks with sturdier models, and added a few more cameras with better resolution. It was satisfying to know that if anyone tried what Gentry had done, they'd be caught before they could do much harm. In a twist I didn't expect, the orchard project opened doors for me. I started attending that farmers market workshop more regularly. I got involved in local agricultural fairs, met experienced orchardists who taught me techniques for grafting and pest control, and even joined a small collective that aimed to promote locally grown produce in the area. We planned a spring festival where small growers could showcase their plants, and I volunteered to host a workshop on planting fruit trees for beginners. Who would have guessed that my desire to secure my property and create an orchard would lead me into such a fulfilling community role? Each season brought small victories. That first winter after the incident, I mulled over how far I'd come since buying the place. I built a small greenhouse next to the barn, just large enough to start some seedlings early next spring. When the snow melted and the ground thawed, I spruced up my property boundaries even more, clearly painting the fence line, trimming back some brush, and making everything as neat and official as possible. I sent a polite letter to the county recorder's office, thanking them for their help and ensuring they had my updated contact information, just in case something ever came up about boundaries again. It was probably around the beginning of the second summer after the vandalism incident that I noticed how settled I felt. I remembered the shock of coming home and seeing all my belongings dumped in the pool, the anger and sadness at the violation of my trust, the fear that Gentry might not stop at just vandalism. Now, I had a flourishing orchard coming along, a network of supportive neighbors, and the knowledge that justice had been served. Gentry was gone, my property lines were uncontested, and I was free to pursue my dreams without harassment. I learned a big lesson from the whole ordeal. Document everything and stand up for yourself firmly but legally. I had tried talking politely. When that failed, I turned to the proper channels. I got a survey, I installed cameras, I involved the authorities when necessary. Instead of cowering or slinking away, I faced the problem head-on. Because of that, not only did I get justice, but I also earned respect from the community. People could see that I wasn't the aggressor, that I valued fairness and truth, and that I wouldn't be pushed around. On a personal level, the biggest challenge was moving beyond the anger. At first, I felt such frustration that it nearly soured my enjoyment of the property. But as time passed, I used that anger as fuel to improve my home, secure my belongings, and get involved in the community. Looking back, it's almost as if Gentry inadvertently pushed me to become a better neighbor and a better steward of my land. I would never thank him for it, of course, but it's a small silver lining in a cloud of conflict. I never did hear exactly why Gentry fixated on that 1.5-acre strip. Perhaps he convinced himself that it was family land out of a sense of nostalgia or pride. Maybe he was just a troublemaker who needed to feel important by causing chaos. It doesn't matter now. The records were clear, and I was rightful owner. The law supported my claim. He paid the price for trying to take matters into his own hands. Corinne, the new neighbor, occasionally stops by at the fence to chat. She's planted a modest flower bed near the boundary line, as she mentioned. Bright marigolds and daylilies bloom there. And we laugh about how that patch used to be the center of a ridiculous dispute. Sometimes she'll say, "I can't believe anyone would fight over this small strip." And I'll just shrug. "Me neither," I say. But that's all in the past. The orchard is doing well. By the third year, the trees had blossoms. By the fourth year, small fruit appeared. I carefully tended to them, thinning out some of the clusters to ensure a healthy yield. Victor came by to help me harvest the first apples. They were tart and crisp, perfect for pies. I baked a few pies and dropped slices off at some of the neighbors who had supported me. One was Jana, who had warned me about Gentry's temper. As she took a bite, she winked and said, "This is what justice tastes like, huh?" I couldn't help but laugh. In time, Gentry's name became a footnote around here. New families moved in, old neighbors moved out, and the story of that strange trespassing and vandalism incident got passed around like a local legend. Some details probably got lost or exaggerated in the retelling, but one thing always remained clear: trying to claim someone else's property, breaking the law, and vandalizing their belongings is not only wrong, but sure to backfire. It was a lesson etched into the collective memory of this little community. As for me, I took pride in knowing I did the right thing. Even when it was difficult, I held on to my dreams, improved my land, strengthened my connections with honest neighbors, and stood firmly for what was mine. The orchard now stands as a symbol of perseverance. Each season it grows stronger, more beautiful, and more bountiful, and I grow along with it. I think the biggest reward in the end is the peace of mind. I can now wake up each morning, step out onto my porch, sitting on a new set of Adirondack chairs I built myself, and sip my coffee in quiet contentment. I can watch the morning sun light up the orchard, see the shadows of the trees stretch across the grass, and listen to the gentle buzz of insects and the distant sound of birds. I know that this land is mine, fair and legal. I know my belongings are safe. I know that if trouble ever arises again, I have both the means and the community support to handle it. That sense of security is priceless. This entire experience also taught me something important about community. Before all this, I was a bit of a lone wolf, wanting my quiet space and solitude. I still enjoy my privacy, but I also appreciate how a community can come together. When people heard about what happened, they offered help, advice, comfort, and encouragement. They reminded me that I wasn't alone out here, that many good people lived nearby. Connecting with them made my victory all the more meaningful. Life moved on. Seasons passed and the orchard matured. The memory of Gentry's trespassing and vandalism became less of a painful wound and more of a story with a moral. If I ever tell it again, I'll say something like, "I once had a neighbor who tried to claim my land and vandalized my property. It didn't end well for him." Then I'd mention how I documented everything, got the authorities involved, and achieved justice through proper channels. And I'd finish by saying, always stand up for what's right and never let anyone push you off your rightful ground. I can't say I'm glad it happened, but I can say I'm glad I came out stronger. The orchard now thrives. My relationships with neighbors are healthy, and my property is secure. Gentry is a chapter closed, and I'm writing new chapters every day. Chapters about growth, harvest, community gatherings, and small personal victories that come from working honestly and respecting the rules we all share. It's been a long journey from that morning when I caught Gentry snarling at my fence line to today, as I watched the leaves flutter in a gentle breeze. But now, I feel at peace. And I know I earned that peace by standing firm, seeking justice, and ultimately building something beautiful from the wreckage he tried to create. Friends, thank you. See you soon.